Ladies and gentlemen, could we make a start? Good evening, everyone. My name is Christopher Finlay. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of the Professions at the University. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Joseph Fischer lecture that's going to be presented by Professor Jagdish Bhagwati. This is the 56th lecture in the series. It's a lecture series organised by the School of Economics at the University. It's been presented here almost every other year since 1904. The funds for the lectures, as well as a prize for a student, were provided by an endowment to the university in 1903 by prominent Adelaide businessman Joseph Fischer. Now, my colleague Kim Anderson has put together the first 53 lectures in the series and published them with the University of Adelaide Press, and here's the link to the site if you'd like to see what is an extraordinary collection of reflections on the Australian economy. So here is another in this very long and significant series in Australia. Tonight's lecture is also part of the Economic Society of Australia Eminent Speaker Series, and we thank the Society for their support and also their national sponsor, who's the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. So let me tell you some more about this evening's speaker. Professor Bhagwati is a Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's University Professor at Columbia University. He's the co-chair of the High-Level Expert Group on Trade, appointed by the governments of Britain, Germany, Indonesia and Turkey. He has uniquely combined a number of very important contributions to the theory of commercial policy. His work has greatly strengthened the case for free trade. He's the author of a number of best-selling books, and he's now a regular contributor to opinion pages of newspapers and magazines on current policy issues. He's the author of more than 300 articles and has contributed to dozens and dozens of volumes. As I mentioned, and it's what I especially enjoy reading as well, is his reflections on current events and policy debates in places like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and he's a regular reviewer for the New Republic and the Times Literary Supplement. He really is one of the most creative international trade people of his generation, and he's a leader in the fight for freer trade. You might have seen some of his recent books. Termites in the Trading System, a great title, discusses the deleterious effects of preferential trading agreements, on which a number of our students are working at the moment, and his previous book was The Defence of Globalisation. He's going to talk to us tonight about multinational corporations and development, changing perceptions. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati.
Thank you. Where shall I speak from? All right. I don't have any slides or anything. I'll just talk from here, okay?
Yep. Good.
Well, thank you, Professor Finlay, and it's wonderful to see many old friends here, like Kim Anderson and several more. It's always a pleasure to be at an Australian campus. I've been here many times, not in Adelaide, but often in Canberra and Sydney. So this time we are going around the country, seeing much more of it, like one of your early explorers or something. But we know a lot about Australia, certainly through your movies, through tennis, and through cricket, of course. Games I don't play. It needs more muscle power than I can muster up, so, because I'm a consumer, not a producer. But it's really a great country, and it's really a pleasure to see more and more Australians on this trip. And we're just charmed. I and Padma both very charmed, and we're learning a lot because economics is pretty advanced, and it's a two-way flow with the outside world. And in my field, in international trade, there are in fact many outstanding figures, Kim included, of course, and Ross Garno and Hal Hill and Max Gordon, whom I saw again after many years, and so on. So I'm delighted. Let me just say that. So when I was asked by Kim to give this lecture, I readily responded and spent the weekend writing it out. So it is available in writing, but I wrote more than I can read, for obvious reasons, and that's my general condition. I often think Obama sounds so unlearned because he doesn't understand that if you want to read something, you've got to stop writing at some stage. And he writes too much. And if he came for a year to the campus, he would realize there's a conflict between the two. But anyway, here I go. I'll just pick on a few themes and then leave the rest for the rest of you to read up and then to challenge me. So I promised the chairman that if he lets me know 5 minutes ahead of time, I'll try and stop exactly on time, because we Indians have a tendency to go on. I mean, we are best described by a sermon with sign I saw that the minister will start talking at 9 a.m. and will go on till further notice. So when they take me seriously, okay? Then I can close on time. First, let me say a couple of things about Mr. Fischer himself, because I'm delighted first, before I do that this lecture has been given by several people I admire. When you've got, 59 people? I'm not surprised that you've covered all the great people in international trade, like James Mead, and I think Max Gordon, who is, I think, a national treasure of Australia, has given it twice. I didn't realize he was given to excess. But in this case, it was good that he did. And then my student, Paul Krugman, from whom I've learned more than I've actually taught him, he too has given it. So I'm kind of, for me, it's both a prestigious thing and a pleasurable thing to be giving this particular lecture. But I was delighted also because Mr. Fischer is someone I would have liked to know, because he's a remarkable man, obviously, on several dimensions. First, he was a successful newspaperman. And I think that's very important to us who write for public policy. Because if we write for only one another, we're never going to have much of an impact. I mean, we'll have it among ourselves, but not on the rest of the world. So if you want to have your ideas attract attention and gain traction, to be able to impact on public policy, which is why you should write for public policy. There's no point writing for public policy if they're good ideas, are not going to get anywhere. So then you have to be able to cultivate the media. The media are extremely important, we know that. So our daughter, when she was actually employed, she wanted to get into journalism school at one time. So I called up Martin Wolf, who fixed her up with the Financial Times and the weekend section, because she was an English literature graduate from Yale. And the editor was Robert Thompson, who is actually an Australian, as you know, and one of Murdoch's people. They're all Australians around there, all with Chinese wives, as it happens. There's some sociological theorem there. I don't know. It's not my field, but so Robert actually put her into handling the book reviews, etc., in the weekend section in the old days, and then she wrote to me saying, "Daddy, it's amazing because the Financial Times is so influential that anytime I call up, people like say, Pavarotti, and say the FT is calling, he'll drop everything and say he'll take my phone." And then she added, "Now I know why you rush out of the shower and I say, Peter Purcell from the New York Times is calling." So newspapers are very important. And that's the other thing, of course, is he was also an accomplished businessman. And I think the businessmen, they create wealth, without which, we could not spend it as professors, right? So that's very important. But it is important not just to accumulate wealth, but also to use it for social purposes. And that is the ideal combination which my colleague, whom I admire, I don't admire all of them, as you know, but certainly this is Simon Schama, the historian who wrote about the embarrassment of riches. And he talked about the Dutch burghers who accumulated, just like businessmen in my hometown of Ahmedabad. They accumulate feverishly, but they don't spend it on themselves. They spend it on social purposes. No self-indulgence, no excess, nothing. And that is the ideal combination. I see from what I read about Mr. Fischer that he in fact would have fitted into this framework because he accumulated money, but he also endowed things, including this lecture series and the students and so on. So that's my ideal, so I'm happy to be speaking in honor of him. And finally, I would say that he also brought a sense of integrity to his business dealings. I mean, he was running a bank, and he wasn't a Madoff, right? So he was really, I mean, I read extensively just to get a background on him. And today, it is very important, and he also ran a bank. He was both a banker and a businessman. And he brought integrity to his dealings. And to me, that's very important, because I think today, one of the things which I worry about, and in the lectures I give on, how do we think of globalization and capitalism after the current crisis? I mean, many people have just despaired of the financial sector and say it produces greed, self-love, whatever you want to call it, and any pejorative, and that it corrupts people who are there. But my view is that really, just like Mr. Fischer illustrates, what you have is the values are, in my opinion, there is an identification problem here. The values we bring to finance affects, or to any activity, affects the way we behave in that activity. For any Madoff, etc. You've got skillions of people like Mr. Fischer who are thoroughly honest. Where do we get the values? Not from being in the financial sector, because that's a vulgar quasi-Marxist thesis that where you work or your means of production affect your values. They don't. I mean, sometimes they do, of course. I mean, nothing is ever totally irrelevant. But people bring values which they pick up from other things, from the family, from the environment, from schools, by reading even great literature. Like, I mean, thanks to Padma, I've read Dostoevsky quite extensively. And Sophia, basically sells herself into prostitution to feed her family. We have a Tatiana here who knows what I'm talking about. And that is a case of conflict of absolutes. And that's a kind of moral question. So we learn morality, values, from a variety of sources, and then we go and work in the real world, making a living, and that's what affects what happens. So a Bernie Madoff is more likely to have developed his know-how in being crooked elsewhere, his lack of values. And why does he go into the financial sector? Because the payoffs there are enormous. I don't know about Australia, but in America, if you go and try and be crooked in the agricultural sector, you've got to have your head examined. The rate of return will be very low. At most, you'll get a little more subsidy, but you've got to suck up to Senator Grassley and so on and so forth all the time. And if you go into the manufacturing sector, you might get 150 million a year, like the Enron people did. But if you go into finance, you can make 150 million a day, maybe an hour. So that's where you would naturally go. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I found Mr. Fischer extremely instructive, and thank you, Kim, for helping me discover him, because I never give lectures unless in honor of people unless I go and find out who they are, all right? And I think here is a role model for the rest of us, and I think we need to draw lessons from that, which will also help us keep an even keel. I thought I would talk about multinationals. Trade, I've spoken ad nauseum, and if someone like Reagan might say, there he goes again. So I want to talk about something a little bit different, namely, how do we view multinationals today, all right? And there's been an evolution of ideas there, and I distinguish between 4 different ways of looking at the interaction of the local economy or national economy into the global economy. And the four different sort of economic philosophical ideas are, one is the benign neglect model or benign impact model. And this is where just fits right into economics, which believes in mutual gain transactions. So it's the way we set up the thing. So if we think of multinationals going in anywhere, they profit, the local companies, the local host companies profit. And there's a lot of theory on that, which I'll come to. So that's a more benign kind of view. The other is a benign intent view, namely that multinationals will go into developing countries, for example, with a view to helping the local people. So it's the white man's burden kind of approach. That today is probably more white woman's approach, because there are lots of women in the NGOs and so on and so forth, far more than than men are, at least in my experience. And I think women on the whole want to do good on the average, and men want to do well on the average. But this is just average tendencies, all right? So you run into many women, educated women, who want to do good, and this is where. So to call it a white man's burden is kind of archaic. People feel that they're doing something useful, and then of course the multinationals ride in on that, and they're supposed to be doing things for people. So this is the benign intent view. Then there is a malign impact view, and that was very fashionable, and I'm going to come back to it a little bit later. And that was the malign impact view was basically floated by many people in South America in particular. Professor Prebisch, who was a great Argentinian economist and the first Director General of UNCTAD, a superb economist who unfortunately believed in import substitution for reasons which I won't discuss now. And he was certainly of the view that multinationals had a malign impact. So he called it the center and the periphery. The periphery would not be able to coexist with the center. The effect on trade, on multinational investment, all of that would tend to create downsides for the poor countries. Of course, today, in many cases, all these fears about the more powerful countries and richer countries having a malign impact on the poor countries has been turned around, as you know. And it's the rich countries where the NGOs, et cetera, believe that they can't possibly compete with poor countries. You've got to sort of stop them from coming in, all sorts of things. So the wheel is turned actually a full circle, or no, half circle, right, on this. But that is a malign impact view. So multinationals didn't come out good. And President Cardozo, who was the sociologist Cardozo, and he invented the dependencia thesis, namely that developing countries would become dependent on the rich countries. Not that that was the intention of the rich countries, but just the international transactions between the center and the periphery, if you want Prebisch's language, and or any other language of the rich and the poor, that will lead to dependence, and therefore it will have a malign impact. He, of course, became, ironically, the first president of Brazil to actually go in for globalization massively. And in my judgment, Lula came in later and won. And Lula, who is, of course, a trade union leader and not into trade, etc., he basically stood on Cardozo's shoulders, because Cardozo's reforms and globalization had led to a substantial improvement of income and growth, which led to a substantial improvement of revenues at any given tax rate, which then enabled him to do all the good things like direct spending on health, education, etc. But without the first step, which Cardozo took, he would never have been able to do that. That's the story of India too. As long as we just kept professing for 50 years that we wanted to help reduce poverty, bring in the marginalized groups, it just remained on the books because there was no money to spend on it. You might say reduced defense expenditure. It's more easily said than done, all right? I mean, my friend Mahbub al-Haq, who is in UNDP selling these ideas and to the World Bank, when he went back and joined Zia's cabinet, and he would typically say, you reduce one tank, and then you'll be able to build 5 primary schools. But then he goes and joins Zia's cabinet. Right there, that's the guy who is actually spending the money on tanks. And he just has to, go along with the flow. So the point is, these are arithmetical issues to say we can do more by just reducing something else, but those things are not reducible. In the end, it was a very rapid growth rate that enabled us to generate the revenues post-91 reforms, which then has now led to enormous expenditures by the system, not necessarily wisely spent, but that's a different issue. But there was no money to spend before. So we had double effect. First, the direct impact effect of reforms on pulling people into gainful employment. About 200 million people were brought in above the poverty line in India in about 15 years. Before that, they were just kept increasing at 3.5% growth rate of income. And now we are into stage 2 reforms, where we are actually spending all these monies, and that's a very difficult area. As I said, I'm not going to discuss that. So I think what I wanted to point out that Cardozo was the one who shifted his attitude on, on the malign impact view. And then, of course, there was the malign intent view, which I think a few people hold on to, which was that really this was part of neo-colonial embrace by the countries to give aid, to have the multinationals go in intrusively and so on. I think, people like President Nkrumah and a few others believed in this neo-colonialist argument. But I think that's on the whole had very narrow impact. So that's sort of put aside. But these are 4 philosophical traditions, and they were to be found in different proportions in different parts of the world. Multinationals started out, so let me start with the multinationals and concentrate on that, not on the others. Because multinationals typically were viewed traditionally as sort of really negative impact or malign impact kind of institutions, at least in the general public. And when it comes to economists, that wasn't so. So let me start with the economics arguments as to why many people thought this was a mutual gain transaction, and why multinationals coming in, of course they don't come in unless they're going to make a profit. So they're going to benefit, all right? The question is whether the host countries are going to benefit as well. And I think many economists started with a primary presumption, and Max Gordon and a whole lot of us were actually arguing on that issue along those lines, that there was a presumption that when multinationals came in, they benefited the host country. And here there were 2 strands in the argument. One was there was a whole lot of models built where the flow of funds was actually the way it was modeled. We know that multinationals are not just flow of funds. In some cases, they don't even bring in funds. But in many cases, they bring in technology, which then they can diffuse to the local people, and to look at it as a something that brings in know-how, etc., not deliberately, but inadvertently sometimes. That is something which needs to be separated out. But the first set of models were on inflow of funds. And Max Gordon has a classic article where he says, if a ship comes in and anchors there, and that's like the multinational, no internal impacts at all. Is it good or bad for you? Now, why is it supposed to be good? Because B economists tend to believe in marginal productivity theory of returns. So if multinational comes in with some money, it leads to incremental output. That incremental output under marginal productivity theory will accrue to the multinational that's bringing in the funds, right? If so, it's more or less quits. It's bringing in, creating private, social marginal product, meaning adding to the income. But according to the productivity theory, it is getting all of it itself. So the rest of us, we can just look on, we are neither worse off nor better off. I mean, that's the basic presumption. Then you go and argue that, look, on the other hand, when multinationals come in, or anybody comes in, they've got to pay taxes. Since there are taxes in the system on multinationals, not always, not in the beginning, because many multinationals get tax holidays, as you know. But that's for a certain length of time, and unless the system gets captured, it's going to disappear down the road. And Naipaul and his guerrillas, he's a very cynical writer, as you know, he was talking about some developing country, British Guiana or something. He said the multinationals that come to enjoy the holidays, and having enjoyed the holidays, they moved on. But the point is, they come in and they contribute something of which they take only half if it's 50% tax rate. So that creates a presumption that the social marginal product for the people, for the host country, is going to be greater than what the multinational takes. So that was the presumption which we all talked about as to why we would think of this as... The other one is much more relevant to the way we think about huge countries like India and China, two countries you're interested in aside from the United States and this country. Certainly China in a big way. If you've got a real wage constant, like in a Marx, Arthur Lewis kind of labor model, then the amount of input that you produce, like a multinational comes in and employs people, then the return to capital is going to be less than the total return to society, because part of that goes into paying for the wages. So people who are unemployed get employed, and that is a social marginal product for the host country. So if you've got a constant real wage, then and slack labor, okay, meaning unemployed labor, then since you're employing this labor, the return to the wages of that labor have to be counted as part of what the multinational contributes. So that is a very big one, okay, in the thinking which influence a lot of people into saying, well, MNCs on the whole are good purely on economic dimension because of these two presumptions, okay? Then you shift attention, because people soon realized it wasn't just money. And there were in fact complaints that the multinationals came in and took $10 of domestic capital as part of their venture compared to bringing in only one, and so on. But so people shifted to bringing in of know-how. And that is really what most people, I think, begin to see as the important component or important contribution. And that contribution basically amounts to really focusing on how the knowledge they bring in diffuses to the system. And there are countless studies on how this happens. Like, it can happen because you're hiring people who then learn the techniques, then go and set up their own thing. Like one of our nephews used to work for Goldman Sachs. And he's a billionaire now because he learned the trade there and then went and set up his own banks and so on and so forth. He's the biggest banker in India. That is true of many people who cut their teeth on multinationals, in one form or another, frequently in the host country, then going on to being further trained in the home country, and so on. So if you look at it as a dynamic picture, a lot of this diffusion takes place that way. Then, of course, there are other ways. You observe how the multinational is working. You're inefficient yourself. That itself can give you ideas. So people have formalized these hypotheses and studied for different, large numbers of different countries. Many of them are Columbia students of one, people like Phoebus Drimes and Padma, me. I don't supervise empirical thesis, but when you're one of three, you can be, putting your oar into the water a little bit. So anyway, we have a whole lot of evidence of that kind, and Nottingham Greenaway has a number of people who have been working on this. So we have a huge amount of evidence that diffusion works, all right? And the original fear of Professor Hirschman, because he said, if foreign firms come in, they're going to intimidate and destroy the local firms. That's another model, okay? Or another idea. That doesn't seem to happen in a big way. The responses are more creative, more diffusion-oriented, and so on. So it's a matter of deciding which model seems to work in practice, okay? And countless numbers of studies show, and these are not by people who are just ideologically stuck on multinationals and so on, and they seem to show that this diffusion really works. So this is the benign model, okay? And I think on the whole, people buy into that. And if you look at what has happened to the policies of the developing countries as any kind of symptom of how thinking has evolved, while they were initially in the Cardozo kind of and Prebisch kind of mold, at least among the influential policymakers who were trying to opt out of competition with the rich countries and thinking this would have a malign impact, gradually the thinking on multinationals evolved into a more benign impact mode. And so I think what you see now today, and I think that's a reflection of it, is that actually developing countries are competing with one another like mad to try and bring in more and more capital, meaning more and more multinationals, because they see that as a way in which you get in. And the transfer of technology is a very important thing. And one thing I will mention because of China, because in the old days, China, India, and a whole lot of countries used to use trade restrictions, as you remember, what we used to call it tariff jumping investment. Somebody supplying, say Philips is supplying radios to your market. You just shut off that market and you tell Philips that unless you come and assemble here in my country, you're not going to be able to get that market. It didn't really work too well because all they did was, assemble 2% of the total product or something to be able to qualify for this. So they just scraped by, like if you're bringing in a car could not be imported. So they would bring in virtually 95% of the car and just put the bumper on it in Bombay, right, in a little factory. So that was a way of cheating, basically. And it was okay. People accepted it. And so it really didn't work. But where now it is working, and I think where it worked was, so this was import substituting investment. That's what we call it. There was also export promoting investment, meaning if you're export oriented, like in Guangdong province and so on, right, in the 4 provinces of China with 650 million laborers at one time, that is where you had essentially rapid exports, and therefore the multinationals were moving into the way the local resources were also being deployed. So Ian Little, who was our professor at Oxford, he once said, foreign investment is as good as your own domestic investment policies. If your domestic investment policies are export-oriented, you'll get a higher rate of return. If they're import substitution-oriented, you'll get a low rate of return. The same thing when the foreign resources come in. So that's another way of looking at it. Where China has changed the equation, in my opinion, and that is an interesting question, actually, is that the Chinese market is now so enormous that they can actually tell firms like Hitachi, NEC, Thomson, and GE, etc., Siemens, and say, if you don't invest here and enable us to take advantage of your technology, we're going to shut you off from the market. In the old days, it didn't work. They tried it with Beijing Jeep, it was called. There's a book by a journalist called Jim Mann. The Chinese tried that years ago with the Jeep which had come in from Chrysler, and they wanted an army Jeep to be manufactured, which is a way of acquiring the technology. And Chrysler just walked out because it was not an important enough market for them to be suckered into doing this, okay? Today, they're bending over backwards to get in. And so this is the big issue now, because the Chinese are using the market and what we would call import substitution investment strategy to extract technology from the rest of the world, because it's such a gigantic market. And nobody has an answer to it, because you can't get collusion among all these firms in different countries. I mean, they're going to compete. They're going to go in. They're going to give technology away. So that is the big policy debate right now, how to handle China, because China is using its huge market to play this game of extracting technology, all right? That gives it a little malign It's not that the multinationals are malign, but the host country is malign. Okay? So I think it's an interesting variation. So now, let me then say that there has been a set of counter arguments, particularly from the NGO side and so on, saying that actually you're having an adverse impact. And how do they argue that? So that's the sort of next step, because we economists and policymakers went into welcoming multinationals, all right? That part I argued. But then there's a backlash, as always, and it came from the NGOs, essentially. And what was the argument there? Do I have another 10 minutes or so? Okay. So let me know 5 minutes ahead. So there, the argument was that if you go and employ local labor, then you're paying them wages which are commensurate with the, I'm putting it in my terms now, okay, which are commensurate with the per capita income of that country. You can't go into a country and say, I'm going to pay Australian wages, when in fact it's Rwanda, Burundi or something, right? They can't afford it. Their per capita income is much less. So you're bound to be paying wages. They might be 10% higher than the average wage in the country, but still going to be miserably low. So if they go and ask these people, are you being paid enough? And they say, of course not. I mean, if you ask me, if my president of my university asks me, which unfortunately he doesn't, are you being paid enough? I'm bound to say no, right? Because that's what in economics we say the marginal utility of income is positive, right? So we say that. But if he says, are you getting better paid than NYU or somewhere? Then I'll say, yes, of course, right? Or in some university in the Midwest or something. Now, of course, there are some universities that pay you enormous sums of money to live in the boondocks, but that's different. But I'm just talking about. So I think in many cases, you've gone and observed, like Philip Grave and others, they've actually done empirical work and have found that the multinationals in their factories are actually paying a wage premium of about 10% compared to the rival outside wage, which means they're actually paying better rather than low. So, and if you look at it in the dynamic terms, again, the impact on wages and on employment depends on whether you're in the Arthur Lewis model, and in which case wages are less, but the employment gets more as you employ more and more people. Or if you join the modern economy, the wages keep rising as you raise the demand for labor, because labor ceases to be slack. All right? So there are two ways in which you can improve working incomes. And that is something where, if you look at a country like China, the enormous growth of demand which multinationals helped them generate, because they came in, invested for exports, right? And in the four Guangdong provinces. That led to a huge expansion in the demand for labor. Everybody on the right, left, north, south, everybody accepts that. The effect of that was to raise the demand so much, and at the same time the supply of labor is upward sloping. Why? Because of the one-child policy. I don't know how many of you have been to China. I mean, I wouldn't ask that question if Ross Garner was here. He spends half his time there, so he knows more about it than anybody could. But the point is, the one-child labor, if you ever go to China, you always have a wonderful young person shepherding you around, all right? Because there are plenty of people who do that. And you ask them, do you have any siblings? They almost never do. There's always a one child. So that's one thing. And the supply of labor from the hinterland is also used to be very strictly controlled. They haven't really abolished that in any way. So the supply curve of labor in our economic terminology is upward sloping. So when demand keeps increasing, what you get is a great benefit to wages. That's what you've been observing in a big way. Of course, it has repercussions for the growth rate and so on, but this is what's happening. So this is a big, powerful factor of MNCs leading and spearheading the drive for exports, right? So it's a combination of the two. If they were coming in like in India for rent creation, rent sharing, nothing would have happened really, in any substantial way. So it's it's a little back again. It's this which has really created a massive transformation. And then to go around and say that, look, I'm going to just change union rights and so on, because they had the union legislation on the books, but it meant nothing, all right? Because you can have all the legislation on the books, but economics really makes it bite, all right? And that's so. So I'm not against legislation. You have to have the legislation, but legislation is only one half. It's one blade of this, and by itself it can't cut anything, right? So I think this is what has happened. 5 minutes, okay. So the last thing I would say is that, and then one more point actually, which I'll make, which is that many of them also say, I mean, I've been in debates where a union leader who's promised not to behave theatrically suddenly takes his T-shirt off and says, this was made in Guatemala, and it was, $1 a day. And that, the Anne Klein jacket, which sells for $100 in New York, compare that with $1 being paid per day. Well, I mean, this is absurd because, for every jacket that comes in and it's sold by Anne Klein, 9 out of 10 fail, right? Because you don't buy them. So you've got to reduce it to a tenth anyway. Then you've got to pay tariffs, which are enormous. You've got to pay insurance and freight. Then you've got to pay going from wholesale to retail. By the time you've done all this exercise, that $1 begins to look pretty good, actually, per day. So I think the point is that people really think in terms which are not economic at all, and think that this is really, really a downside. So I think a lot of our time has been spent, since I write in defense of globalization, or at least saying globalization is helpful rather than harmful, this is one of the things we've had to fight in regard to multinational investments. Not the policy makers in developing countries don't pay much attention to it, but it could affect the policies of the developed countries in terms of putting restrictions on outflow of investment, etc. So it is important to get these arguments sorted out. The last thing I would say is that one of the things we do need to worry about increasingly, I've talked about the benefits to the developing countries or the harm, but one thing, of course, is what about the rights and duties of the multinationals themselves? In the OECD approach to a code for multinationals, the whole focus was on how to protect the multinationals from all kinds of things, meaning the rights of the multinationals. And that simply won't wash. The code went nowhere. Because a code has to be like a tripod. The rights of the multinationals, the rights of the host countries, and I haven't had time to talk about that, and then the obligations, the duties of the multinationals. And that is something which now is increasingly in the picture with the corporate social responsibility argument, which you now increasingly see. And I think most multinationals have bought into it now, partly to protect their arse, as it were, because, look at what Occupy did, the Occupy movement in New York. They were after all kinds of people on Madison Avenue, the rich guys and so on. But one guy they spared, and that was George Soros, because George Soros is a Democrat. He's actually been convicted of insider trading. That doesn't matter to these guys. So for them, other people have to pay for it. But if you just look it up in the Financial Times or under the European Court of Justice, he's actually been convicted. But because he's done so much, CSR or just expenditure on causes, he's protected himself, basically. So one argument for doing CSR is that when Naomi Klein decides to go after you, it's great to be able to have made this kind of investment. So that's an argument for being a good person. It's like advertising expenditure, right? It is good for your firm. But I think there's more to it than that, because I do think that corporate social responsibility is also a matter of doing good. Milton Friedman says, why should the firm do it? Because when the money goes out and is given to us dividends, to us, we should do it, right? There's nothing like the firm owing something. But that's a very narrow argument, because today firms are treated as legal persons. And as you remember, that was the basis of the argument of Justice Roberts' famous judgment, right? I mean, on firms being able to make contributions, they were legally persons. So they are legal persons. And to common people outside of this Justice Roberts' judgment, they are legal personas. So we expect IBM, we expect all kinds of firms to be able to step forward and function in the community and do something. I will only make 2 points and then end. And one is that being the case, so I would not go along with Milton Friedman on this, looking at the way the sociology of the firms has evolved in the public eye. I would simply say that if it is the firm that's making that investment, then there's no reason why the managers and the CEO should be able to decide what that money is going to be used for, what kind of social purpose. They should bring in the workers and the entire firm, the different stakeholders, as we say, because that's a firm. It's not the managers. But often you see managers coming up on TV ads and saying, we are doing this, we are doing that. But it's really, it should be a more democratic decision in my view. And the second thing, of course, is that a number of people like the UN agencies and so on have moved in on the act and said, we're going to tell you, all the firms, what should be done by you. Now, I distinguish between two things, and that's my just one additional observation, which is that you can't tell firms what not to do. That can be standardized. We can all agree on that, like we shouldn't dump mercury into the Rio Grande or into a river, right? I mean, that's pretty heinous. Or you shouldn't send children into hazardous occupations. All reasonable people, now there are some unreasonable ones too, but all reasonable people will agree that that makes sense, okay? So these are a series of don'ts, and there we can have a standardization. But when it comes to do's, like what should you spend on to make life better for people, including in your, then nobody should be able to tell me how to do it. I should let 100 flowers bloom, and even God can't tell me, because what we teach human beings in terms of the way they behave morally is that you should examine your own conscience and decide on your own set of moral actions. We don't want standardization there. What IBM does should not be what an Australian firm does. So I think that's what I've been fighting actually in a big way, that CSR should not be standardized on the do's. It can be standardized on the few don'ts, all right? But the whole tendency on the part of NGOs, unions, everybody, plus the Global Compact, etc., is to try and move it into a rigid mold. And I think that would be a terrible waste of this impulse. But I think that's where the action is at now. It's in a very different area, not where the multinationals are harming or helping the developing countries, but what should be their obligations, which was in low key when we were writing way back. And I think this has now become so the evolution of thinking has now moved in that direction, which is quite an interesting set of problems, which are somewhat different from the way we used to pose the problem in the old days. But on the whole, I think it's, it is a good development from my perspective. It's a very good development because it will also enable the firms to occupy a much easier place in world society and economy if they do this, and that plus our old arguments, plus the rejection of the false arguments about how they're screwing these poor workers in developing countries, etc. All of that should add up to a much better way in which we think about multinationals instead of carrying placards saying, down with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking us through those changing perceptions of multinationals and development. We've got a few moments for questions. Who'd like to begin?
So if I could just
I think we can pick up the sound if you just speak loudly and clearly, as my mother used to tell me.
I'll just bellow. Thank you very much, Professor. A wonderful lecture. I'm just wondering if you can add another dimension to it, which is about, I suppose, the environmental dimension. Because sort of one of the arguments against multinationals has been that they've been a means by which basically the West can externalise externalities, if you like. So, perhaps picking up on where you finished, just talk briefly about the environmental dimension of multinationals.
Yeah, I think there are two ways of looking at it. In my book on In Defense of Globalization, there's a chapter on the environment where I took a slightly benign point of view, and I'm not entirely sure I buy into it, because I'll give you a qualification in a moment, which was from an economic point of view. I said, supposing Canada is felling forests and sending them to United States. And my point was there that it wasn't really international trade which was a problem. It was the fact that the Canadians didn't value their forests good and well enough and didn't have laws in place in order to protect their forests. So I said what we need is really the pollution, or rather the environment protection thing. In the old days, nobody worried about the environment, as you know. When I was the student's age, who ever thought of environment? And I remember, Kim will remember, when we tried to think of production externalities, we were just desperate to think of any examples. And James Mead, the great Nobel laureate, had to fall back on bees and orchards to think of an externality. I mean, it's ridiculous. We couldn't think of all these things we worry about today. So I think that is one thing. But I think I've changed my mind a little bit in the sense that, I mean, in the political economy direction, which is that when you do have enormous markets already lined up, it's very difficult to get those those environmental protection laws, because these guys can affect your government. So I would say there is a role for NGOs to be ranting, raving, screaming, whatever is necessary. And for all of us to join in, because say in a country like Indonesia, which is close to you, in the Borneo forests and so on, there you do see that the Indonesian government not being exactly like the Canadian government, I mean, in terms of worrying about such things, that in fact the forests have been felled in a big way, because it's so profitable in the international market, and the local governments are not particularly lobbying proof, right? And this is where, again, it's the people who are demanding also are probably in league with the people who are actually felling the forest. Now, how to handle that is the only way to do it is to agitate, I guess. I can't think, because once the governments have been captured or are influenced by lobbies, then you have to go to a public space, right? Because then it's a case of what we call political market failure. It's like economic market failure. And that's something which we used to be aware of when we were discussing multinational. But I think I've become more impressed with that kind of argument over time, having seen how many times governments do get captured. In fact, this issue has come up, if I may just make one observation, in relation to trade in bads, meaning hazardous products. Because all our theorems on trade, on welfare effects of trade, are on trade in goods and services. But if you have trade in bads, like you're sending out hazardous products, the multinationals, and this is one of the things which in the paper which I hope you'll read, they have gone ahead and said often that if this is a bad here in the United States, but the people in the receiving countries haven't got any legislation, so they obviously don't consider it to be a bad. So it's bad here, but it's a good there. And then they go and export the hazardous products. But of course, those governments may not have the knowledge. And two, they're probably in the pockets of there were tiny little countries in many cases, often not even democratic. There's no local public transparency and real democracy. So then it becomes a sham kind of argument, right? Because these companies which are using that argument are using that to actually inundate these with hazardous products, which we're not allowed to consume ourselves. So that is the sort of thing we, at least I as an economist, have been fighting, because people always say trade is good. But it's there's trade in goods, and then trade in services also, which are similar. And then there's trade in bads here and goods there, trade in goods here and bads there, and trade in bads. There are 4 types of trade. And we have to really, your question becomes very pertinent to 3 out of those 4. Okay? So I'm with you. Thank you for that question.
What are your thoughts on I've read your comments on Project Syndicate, but
On what?
I've read some of your comments on Project Syndicate about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit further about what you think.
Well, that's a big topic. No, you can't. I mean, by the time I've said Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's already 2 minutes. I would just say one thing, which is that this is an American response to Chinese threat, because America went down south to the Americas, the South America and so on. And when it went in for regionalism as against multilateralism, it went south, and it ignored coming to Asia. I mean, some of us had been using the second best argument, saying, if you don't be regional, but if you must be regional, then go to the east, right? So of course they wouldn't listen, because they'd prospered by going west, as you know, in their history. So maybe they could think of going east. But then they were biting their fingernails, because this is a dynamic growing region. So they have now used the opportunity provided by Chinese aggression on foreign policy in South China Sea, East China Sea, a string of pearls and interventions around India. So everybody is now agitated about the Vietnam is agitated, Singapore is agitated, Malaysia is agitated. So the Americans found a way to get back into the region. So they've come back in. But of course all the lobbies have gotten into the act also. There are all kinds of things being put in by hundreds of lobbies. I mean, probably it'll be that thick because the NAFTA treaty is about this thick. The other one, TPP, with all these more and more lobbies in the act in Washington, will be probably about that big. Do you want to buy into all that rubbish which is coming from there? And it will also prevent countries like India and China from joining, because they don't want this rubbish as part of a trade treaty. So what I was telling the trade minister the other day, with whom I had dinner with Ross Garner, I didn't know he was a trade minister. I asked him, who was a trade minister? He said, I'm. So I got free access. So I said, Australia should say, you should be, that you want open regionalism. You don't want the region, the Asia, to be divided into those who won't sign and those who will. All these other things. So it's a bit like, so I said, why don't you insist that that it should be open regionalism, in the sense that anybody who wants to join TPP has to just make trade concessions, right? And trade, but not sign on to all these things. And so the analogy I gave him was that if I have to join a golf club, naturally I have to be able to learn to play golf and learn how to put little balls into little holes. I don't know why that's pleasurable, but that's what golf is about. But if you say, look, I've got to put on a tie and I've got to go to church with all these wretched fellows and so on and so forth, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, so they may have 50 such conditions. So I said, let Australia, which has no interest in confronting China, nor in confronting the United States, to look both ways, and the only way to look both ways is to have them integrated. And this is the way to do it, because China then would come in, India would come in. India has just now returned to EU the proposed treaty, which had several things like that. And India said, just strip it of all these other things, confine it to trade, and we'll happily sign. Lula has actually even rejected labor conditions as part of the thing, although he's the foremost trade union leader, because he doesn't want it to be misused for protectionist purposes, which the union lobbies, unfortunately, because they fear trade. Unfortunately, they fear trade. So they've put that in as a way of raising cost of production elsewhere. And so, these are the hundreds of pages written on all these topics, but the bottom line is Australia can play a role. It's big enough to be able to do something constructive rather than split the region into two, because the Americans have split South America into two. Lula and Mercosur people don't want all these things, so they have their own idea of free trade agreement with the Americas, and the Americans have been pushing the NAFTA model through Mexico and the Andean Common Market. They will buy anything. And so the US is putting in all kinds of conditions into those. So that continent is divided into two groups, which is all unfortunate. I mean, we really want more and more integration, right, as this route goes. So it's a very different model from adding more countries and so on, you know, the way it's working out. And if somebody has to tell the United States, look, you can't go on like this, that, you know, when you say a TPP with all these conditions, you know, they call it in euphemistic terms. It's a model agreement. It's the agreement for the 21st century. And I told the minister, you should tell them that it's really an agreement for the 22nd. Let's think more further ahead and leave the 21st alone.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our allotted time, and let me draw the proceedings to a close. It's been such a exciting and refreshing evening. A real privilege to have Jagdish Bhagwati in Adelaide. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us your enthusiasm for these questions, your wide scan of a range of ideas, your tremendous skills in bringing them to a debate, and your strong interest in bringing the data to the question. All of these great strengths of a great economist. Ladies and gentlemen, Jagdish Bhagwati.